So the illegal migrant Harush Kabatu was accidentally released from prison after he was supposed to be being deported after receiving a 12-month prison sentence for horrific sex offences, and is now being arrested a couple of days later. Now, I'm very sorry to say that this is the most ridiculous example of a complete failure of a justice system I've ever seen. Now, I am not one to usually push and peddle conspiracy theories, but I am really struggling to believe that this was a complete accident, because how on earth does this possibly happen in the first place? Because it is not as simple as a mix-up of paperwork, because as I'll show you in a moment, this guy was wandering around outside the prison for about an hour and a half at least, according to a lorry driver who was at the scene, who was there, and he saw Harush Kabatu asking people where he's supposed to go and what he's supposed to do. He even asked this lorry driver, what is he supposed to do? Because they just let him out. So there was an hour and a half worth of opportunity for people to actually check and think, hang on a minute, is this guy supposed to be being released? Now, working in reverse, the Met Police now say that having been released in error from Chelmsford Prison, he's now been arrested. He was located by Met officers near Finsbury Park, which is extraordinary given the sentencing remarks, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, which illustrate the complete and utter failure of a justice system. Because he was near a park where clearly lots of other people will be, and lots of other people may be fall victim to people like him. So let me go for a moment just back to these sentencing remarks here. Again, moving straight to the end here. He was put on the offences register, the sexual offences register. There was a sexual harm prevention order made, and this, quoting the judge, is necessary to protect members of the public, women and children, from harm by him. And so this means that he's prohibited by this judge from approaching any lone female not previously associated with him on any public highway, common land, wasteland, parkland, or playing or recreational field, other than inadvertently and not reasonably avoidable in the ordinary course of daily life. He must not follow, harass, or intimidate any female in any place or to which the public have access to. And having any contact or communication of any kind with any child under the age of 18, or to seek to be in their company, other than such as is inadvertent and not reasonably unavoidable, etc. And he was required to allow a police officer or designated monitoring officer appointed by the chief constable for the area where he lives, unhindered access to his registered address or any address that he lives in. Obviously, he was in prison at the time before being released. But the point being, with all these orders of this judge being in place, because he was sentenced to 12 months in prison for these offences, to then be accidentally released by the prison service to wander around anywhere he likes, which is illustrated by this CCTV footage here by the Met Police. This was whilst they were still looking for him. He was just seen here wandering around, carrying this distinctive bag, and the police putting out this request for people to come forward and say if they've found where he is. But as I said, this was not just a spur-of-the-moment accident. He was hanging around for quite some time. I will link this video here by Sky News. I'll play a small clip of it for you. I can't play the full thing because of copyright fair use, but I will put this in the description below. Have a listen to this.
So I was delivering a fridge and a freezer, temporary fridge and freezer, to Chelmsford Prison. I arrived there approximately 10:10 yesterday morning. Cut a long story short, basically my lorry was too long to take into the actual prison airlock for them to check it. So I'd parked outside, popped in, showed them my ID, showed them who I was at the point of where the guy was released. So I went in, gave him my ID, the guy was released. He walked out of the airlock. He then kept returning back to the airlock and basically saying to the officers there, where am I going? What am I doing? I don't know where I'm going, what I'm doing. He was holding a pack of paperwork in his arm, literally like that, holding his bag of bits. You could see inside his clear bag, had brown bits where it said evidence and stuff like that on it.
So he didn't know what was happening?
No, he knew he'd been deported. So he'd come over to me and said, I need you to help me, I need you to help me. His English was pretty good, to be honest with you.
And that's another point that was picked up by the judge here. He argued to the court in his mitigation that his English was limited and that he had mental health issues, etc. But the court had concluded that he was just being manipulative and he had absolutely no remorse. Coming back to those sentencing remarks just for a moment, there's a number of things in here that should really have raised alarm bells. This should have been a high-profile prisoner due for deportation. Bearing in mind he was at the centre of all of the protests in Epping for the hotels, the case that went to the High Court and then even the Court of Appeal, which overturned the injunction to shut down the hotel. And there are repeated protests week after week about this hotel, which is where he came from, which is the epicenter of all of these protests and frustrations of the local community. This was the guy who was convicted of these offences, and these are some of the comments by the court here. Judge said the pre-sentence report indicates that he was very reluctant to speak about the offending. He argued a lack of English and mental health difficulties, but they concluded he was just being manipulative. He said that the UK was too strict. He offered no explanation for anything. It was evident, the judge said, that his shame and remorse was not because of the offences, but because of the impact that they'd had. In other words, he was not upset about the offending that he'd done, but for being caught, essentially. The judge said, you seek to portray yourself as the victim and suggest that you've been made a scapegoat. You show no remorse at all for your behaviour. So all of this, you would have thought, would make him a high-profile prisoner, someone that they absolutely would want to ensure is straight on a plane and deported, because that is what they wanted. We have West Streeting here saying it's a huge relief that he's been arrested. Frankly, I think it is absolutely astonishing and frankly embarrassing for the UK that this has happened in the first place. HM Prison Service instructed governors in England and Wales to implement additional checks before inmates are released by Monday. A prison officer has been suspended pending investigation, but a senior prison staffer told BBC that this was down to a series of mistakes, probably because staff are overworked and in short supply. I'm not entirely sure I accept that, and I'll tell you why. Because even if there was one member of staff there, more so they would be careful about who they release. They are releasing prisoners out into the public. They would at the very least check their name. Now, I do not believe for a moment that there is any shred of possibility that somebody reading his name, particularly if they work in the prison service or anywhere within the justice system, how on earth would they not know who this guy was and that he's at the centre of all these protests and that he was due to be deported and that the reason he's being released somehow is because he's being deported. He's not serving his full sentence. He was to be deported. This goes on. It's not just one prison office who's to blame. That would be unfair. Now, that to me, again, being somewhat cynical about this, if it's not just one person, but a multitude of different people and different offices, that is compounding the error, compounding the mistake, compounding the embarrassment, and also compounding my cynicism. Because if it's not just one person that made this mistake, but a series of people who collectively allowed this guy to be released into the public when he was not supposed to be released. Again, I am not one to peddle conspiracy theories, but how can this possibly be an accident? It is absolutely staggering, and it does push me to think maybe there is something up here, because like I said, I generally don't believe in conspiracy theories. I generally believe that there's usually an explanation for it. I call it system and reality. System is this is how it's supposed to work, and the reality is things get skewed, deadlines get missed, documents get mislaid, all sorts of different things happen, and very often the weakest part in this whole system is usually a person of some sort in some position. They either make a strange decision or they make an error, or that error is then passed on to other people. They repeat the same error and so on. Now, apparently a report from the Prison and Probation Service said 262 prisoners in England and Wales, 262 were released in error between April 24 and March 25, and up 115 in the previous 12 months. West Streeting said it's a huge relief that this guy is now in custody and is going to be reported. The Justice Secretary, David Lammy, has ordered an investigation into how on earth that it was that a dangerous man who due for deportation was instead released onto the streets. He said that work's underway. We'll be open and transparent with the public about what went wrong and what we're going to do about it. Now, if you've probably, hopefully, most of you watching have never seen a prison, but if I could describe it to you, every single step you move through a prison is through a locked door and security checkpoint. You cannot get anywhere even near the prison, much less inside and through it, without going through security checks, and there'll be somebody there checking who you are, what you're doing there, what ID you have with you, why you're moving from one place to another. And that is obviously especially strict and stringent on the reverse when you're coming out, because they want to check who is coming out and that you're not a prisoner in disguise trying to get out. This, I frankly find it difficult to believe that this happened in the first place. And all of this bearing in mind, just to reiterate, this was a guy who'd been sentenced to 12 months in prison, was therefore going to be deported because he was living in a migrant hotel. The judge put him on the sex offenders register and to remain subject to the requirements for 10 years. The judge also made a sexual harm prevention order, prohibited him from approaching any lone female not previously associated in any public highway, common land, wasteland, parkland, playing, recreational field, anywhere. And yet he was found in Finsbury Park. So he could have been doing anything, anywhere, to anyone, because obviously he is now a convicted offender. And the judge did all that was necessary, made this order, and therefore was required to have a monitoring system put in place by the police. So he should have been monitored by the police as well, notwithstanding that he went into prison. And so you might consider this a complete collapse of the system. If this is not a wake-up call to everybody involved, and to be fair to David Lammy, he said he was appalled on behalf of the public, he's starting an investigation, going to find out what's happening. But as I said, if this is not a wake-up call that this system does not work, when we've prosecuted somebody, sentenced them to prison, they were in custody, in prison, they were due to be deported, and they were just released. And then apparently he got out, he wandered around, he boarded a train and ended up in a park somewhere. If all of that is not a wake-up call that this is not protecting the public, I don't know what is. But either way, do let me know your thoughts and comments in the box below, and I'll see you in the next one.